All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Hussein Jaffer. I work for Pinchin, of course, and work for the Hazardous Materials Department here in British Columbia. Today's webinar is in regards to asbestos and hazardous materials in BC. We're expecting over 100 participants to join the session today. So really looking forward to sharing our knowledge with you folks. This is information we regularly provide to our clients, either informally or formally, help them better understand the requirements under the regulation. We also speak to some newer initiatives in regards to asset retirement obligations, as well as the new worker asbestos certification requirements that were unveiled by WorkSafe BC earlier this year. Brian, I'll get you to move to the next slide there. So just before we get started, some housekeeping items here. We are recording the session, so everybody knows that. At some point, we'll be posting this on our website and be available for those that want to come back and have a look, or those that had missed it. We typically use the chat function for any sort of technical issues. We have somebody who is looking at that chat function and will be able to respond to you directly if there is an issue. So if you do have any sort of technical issues, please put it in the chat function. Do ask that everybody maybe raise their hand right now so that I know I'm being heard. This is often one-way communication, so great, I can see a lot of hands going up there. That's awesome. And then we'll use the Q&A there for any questions that you may have. We'll typically look at answering all questions at the end of the session, as that helps us consolidate the questions and save some time. And as mentioned, we will be recording. So if we don't happen to get to all the questions, what we'll do is we'll take those back and get back to the individual people with their questions as necessary. Last thing I'll say is our feedback is very important. Helps us improve our sessions, lets us know if we hit the mark there with what you're expecting, and also lets us know if there's anything else you want to hear about or would like to hear more of. So please do share your feedback and what you're looking for, and we'll help improve our sessions in the future, of course. Get you to move to the next slide there. Let me get you to go on one more there. Great. So just introducing us here. Myself, my name is Hussein Jaffer. As I mentioned, I work for the Hazardous Materials Group here in BC. I started my career in occupational health and safety. Been working in the industry for over 20 years, and I recently moved into this division here over the last couple of years to help manage the BC department here. Martin, I'll get you to introduce yourself before I introduce Brian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Sheridan. I'm a certified industrial hygienist and Canadian registered safety professional. I'm a project manager in the hazardous materials department here at Pinchin. I'm also the regional practice leader for BC. So I assist the group with technical issues, internal training, and external training. I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
And Martin will be keeping an eye on the questions as they kind of come in and help consolidating them, and then we'll be presenting them for Brian, or he'll answer himself at the end of the session there. And then Brian is our speaker today. He is our operations manager for Pinchin in our BC office. He has a wealth of experience, over 19 years of experience in hazardous materials, and has really managed many of our large hazardous materials projects here in BC. Myself and others often turn to Brian for support on complicated projects, as he's seen it all really. And overall, he's a really great guy to have working for us, and he's so knowledgeable and really makes us laugh. So hoping he can do that for you today as well. Go over to the next slide there, Brian. Great. So before I hand it over to Brian, just a little bit about us. We were established in 1981 by our founder, Don Pinchin, who really was big on research. He wrote many of the regulations we find today are based on the research he was doing in 1981, and has really shaped the asbestos world over that time. Our core services there around hazardous building materials, indoor environmental quality, environmental due diligence, occupational health and safety, all started, in the first decades after that, after we first started there. And then over I would say the last 15 to 20 years, we've been expanding with what we call enhanced services. So, quickly saw that there were other service lines that really complemented the service lines we were providing, and helped provide our clients with more solutions to their projects, and help them manage their projects even better. So that includes building science and sustainability, construction project management. Another one on there is around environmental sciences, mechanical engineering as well. That really align well with our core service lines there. Get you to move over to the next slide there, Brian. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Brian. We'll have our first poll question that we like to do. There's a few of these throughout, just to get a better idea of who we have on the line, and the knowledge base as well. So here, I'll launch this poll, and then Brian, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Hussein. So yeah, the first poll is, what are the following best describes any of the properties that you represent? So residential, apartments, rental apartments. It could even be strata management, commercial properties, vendors, commercial office space, retailers, that sort of thing, or institutional, whether that's schools, hospitals, universities, that kind of thing, or it could be other utilities, maybe in the resource sector, mining, BC Hydro, that kind of thing. So give a second there for people to click on the poll question.
Yeah, I think it's stabilized there, so I'll end it.
Okay. I'll flip over to the next slide.
So I'll just let everybody know here, we have about 15% in residential, about 45% in commercial, and 30% in institutional properties and facility management, and then about 11% found the other category.
Excellent. That's a pretty good spread. So just an overview of our topics here. So we'll kind of quickly go over what is asbestos, and we'll talk about friable versus non-friable, and what the significance of that is. And then we'll go through roles and responsibilities for owners and employers around the WorkSafe BC regulation, and kind of what you need to be doing in your workplaces to kind of make sure you are in compliance with the regulation. We'll touch on asbestos management programs and what that's all about. We'll kind of go over some different types of asbestos or hazardous materials reports that you may require, when you require them, what the difference is between them. And we'll kind of go through some project triggers, workflows, and tips and tricks if you do have an abatement project or a renovation project coming up. We'll kind of give you a flow as to what you can probably expect if you're going to be dealing with hazardous materials. And the last two things there, they're kind of some newer things on the landscape, but asset retirement obligation. So if you are sort of working in the public sector, this is something that you may be interested in. And then some updates to WorkSafe BC around asbestos worker training and certifications. So what is asbestos? So it is actually a naturally occurring silicate that's been found and mined all over the world for literally thousands of years. There's evidence dating back that the Greeks and Romans were actually using asbestos fibers in various garments and different things. So it has been used for thousands of years. A lot of the reason why asbestos was used a lot of times is it does have a lot of beneficial properties, but it's also pretty inexpensive to mine and extract. And some of those properties, when you add them to certain building materials, it enhances that material in various ways. So it can create better heat resistance, electrical thermal resistance. It's very hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. Resists oxidation and mold growth, but a lot of times it was added in for really no other purpose than it was a cheap filler product that you could add 20 or 30% into your material, and you would put that material to market. And for some materials, it's obvious why it was added for thermal or electrical insulation, but for other materials, really there is no obvious reason why it was added. But it is literally in hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of materials that are out there. So hopefully this shared properly. But when we're talking about asbestos, one of the key things we're referring to is the material friable or not. So, assuming everyone. I'm hoping everyone heard that. So an asbestos material is something that can crumble. You can crumble in your hand when it's dry. The significance of that is the fibers in the material are released from that material. They become airborne. You breathe those fibers in. That's how you become exposed. So there's a number of different friable materials out there. We're not going to kind of go through all of them, but typically you have materials like, if you're starting at the top left and we're going clockwise, so spray applied fireproofing that would be sprayed onto structural steel, columns, decks, joists, that kind of thing. That provides a fire rating in the building. And there's not a lot of that stuff left in the lower mainland BC. Most of that material has been abated through the last 30 or so years. Then moving to the right, you have asbestos pipe insulation on steam pipes, radiant hot water heating pipes, sometimes even domestic water pipes and rainwater leaders. You have vinyl sheet flooring, the paper backing, that can be friable. In the top right, you have a loose fill vermiculite. And then below that is actually the loose fill vermiculite in a block wall that would be used as filler insulation in that block wall. So a lot of times you don't know it's there until it starts leaking out or you drill a hole. Same thing below that photo, you have a picture of vermiculite in a residential attic space. So it would be poured in between the joists and then sometimes covered up with pink insulation or blow-in insulation or something like that. Again, you may not know that product's there, and if you are looking to kind of purchase a home, you may want to inspect the attic space, especially if that home was built, prior to kind of 1980, is when the heavy use of vermiculite was put into residential homes. And if we kind of go to the middle, far left, that's a close-up of spray applied texture, so the top and bottom photo there. So pretty common, spray applied texture on ceilings, walls, either in homes or apartments, can contain asbestos. And then moving to the right, you have a lay-in ceiling tile and a glue-on ceiling tile. Not super common to find those anymore, but we do come across them every now and then. And then the bottom middle two photos are various types of pipe insulation. You have a hot water storage tank. And then to the right of that, you have a product called air cell, which you'll find on straight sections of pipe. So here's just kind of a snapshot of different friable materials you may come across in the building. And usually these materials are containing anywhere from about 5, even up to about 80, 90% chrysotile, and sometimes andesite. So moving to non-friable materials, the difference here is that the fibers are actually bound into the matrix of the material. So in order to get some sort of release of fibers out of that material, you have to put a lot of energy into it, hit it with a power tool, drill into it, break the material apart. And I'll just go. floor tile. Added the putty that you find on a building exterior. So because the fibers are bound into the matrix of the material, they're not as easily released or liberated from that material, which means that when you have non-friable materials, even when you are removing that material, there's a lot lower chance of having asbestos exposure or as high of an asbestos exposure. So because of that, you can remove these materials with reduced respiratory protection requirements. You sometimes don't need to even build a containment to remove these materials. So big significant difference between friable and non-friable materials. And then here's some different ones. So again, starting at the top left, you have drywall joint compound. So it's just the mud that is used on the joints of the drywall that actually can contain asbestos, not the actual gypsum board itself. Then you have plaster, which sometimes can become friable depending on the condition, but generally in place it's considered not friable. You have vinyl floor tiles. Moving to the right there, they can either be 12 by 12 or 9 by 9, various different colors and patterns. And then on the far right is a transite pipe. So that would be a rainwater leader, and it's an asbestos cement product. So those actually you can find well into the 1990s. If you move below that, you have a sink mastic. That gold material on the underside of the sink can contain asbestos. And then beside that, you have vinyl floor tile adhesive. So that black material that's used to glue down the vinyl floor tiles can contain asbestos. Then you have duct mastic. So red, gold, silver, black, all colors that can contain asbestos. And then on the bottom left is you have asbestos transite paneling. So same material as used as for the piping, but it's made into panels. So in this case, it's a corrugated panel that would go on the exterior of a building, but you could also get flat sheets of transite that could be used for various other construction projects. So moving on to roles and responsibilities, and this is kind of tied into the WorkSafe BC regulation. And we're not going to kind of go through all of it because we don't have enough time. But the main part, we'll kind of hit on the highlights and the kind of the key parts in terms of managing asbestos in the building. So owner's responsibilities under 6.4 of the regulation is ensuring that there is an up-to-date asbestos inventory of your building. So if you've had a consultant come to your building, go through the building, collect samples, provide you a report, that would be, you would need to have that compliant with 6.4 of the regulation. And then 6.5 is the owner or employer must ensure that asbestos containing materials in the workplace are identified by labels, signs, or some other effective means. So you've gone through and you've tested the building materials, you know where your asbestos is. Now you need to have some sort of labeling process. And depending on the type of building, that labeling program will vary. And then 6.6 is actually kind of tied to 6.4. So ensuring that a risk assessment is conducted by a qualified person on the asbestos materials in the building. So what they're saying there is they don't want to just have a glorified list of here's where all of asbestos is in our building. They want to know what the exposure hazard of those materials are. So in order to do that, when a consultant or an assessor is going through your building, they're looking at these building materials and they're looking at how accessible is that material? Is it accessible to all building occupants, in a general lobby area, or is it, behind a locked door, above a ceiling, maybe in a crawl space or something like that? So how accessible is it? What's the condition of that material? Is it good, fair, or poor? And then is the material friable or non-friable? So those are kind of the three key criteria that we'll look at when we're assessing materials. There is one more. If we're looking in a return air plenum, we need to kind of take that into account as well. But those three criteria there will tell us what the potential exposure hazard is for that asbestos material in the building. And every line of data that at least Pinchin collects takes that into account. And then 6.7 is ensuring that all friable asbestos materials in the workplace are controlled by removal, enclosure, or encapsulation. So if you do have friable asbestos materials in your workplace, it is something that WorkSafe BC sort of expects that you are dealing with in some manner. So a little more on roles and responsibilities, specifically as it pertains to Part 20 of the regulation. So Part 6 is essentially around management or identification of asbestos material, and also goes through removal requirements and procedures. Part 20 is more specific to demolition or renovation of a building. So you have your baseline inventory. Now maybe you have a floor of a building, the tenant has moved out, you want to strip that down to base and have a new tenant come in and they kind of do their own tenant improvements. Prior to doing that, there is some responsibilities for the owner / employer. You need to ensure that a pre-construction hazardous materials assessment is completed. So that assessment is more in depth than the baseline assessment, and we kind of talk about that a little bit later, but it also includes other hazardous materials, lead, paint, mercury, PCBs, chemicals, flammables, needles and sharps. There's kind of a whole list on the website. And then once you have that report and the project is ongoing, you need to make sure that those reports are available on site. So if you've passed this work on to a general contractor or something like that, you need to make sure that that contractor has all of that information with them on site, and it's available in case a WorkSafe officer does come by or another trade comes by, that information is available. Ensure that all hazardous materials are removed or contained prior to demolition. So obviously a key thing, prior to any demolition happening, all of the asbestos or hazardous materials are removed from the building before the demolition contractor, swings the hammer on site. And then a lot of times what happens is that fourth bullet there is ensuring that any kind of new concealed materials that are uncovered during demolition are tested prior to disturbance. So when we do an assessment, we're probably finding 75, 85% of the materials. And some of the materials we just can't get to. They're behind materials that require significant demolition, machine demolition to sort of get to. So when those materials are uncovered, the contractor needs to stop, have the material tested, and then whether or not it's asbestos containing or a hazardous material, then they deal with it accordingly. And then at the end, there needs to be some sort of confirmation that all of the materials have been removed. So usually you'll have a consultant come to site. Sometimes a contractor will also provide this if they have a qualified person on staff, and they'll provide sort of a clearance report to say all hazardous materials on this job site have been removed. So that needs to be provided in writing. And then 20.112 is the notice of project. So this is filed with WorkSafe BC a minimum of 48 hours prior to any hazardous material, or in this case, asbestos material removal happens. So if that notice of project is not filed, then obviously you're not going to be in compliance, but there is a provision for emergency requirements if you have a flood in a hospital or something like that, and you need to have a contractor come in and start working immediately. This contractor could start the work while their office files the NOP on an emergency basis. Right. And so now an asbestos management program. So what is an asbestos management program? It is essentially a policy and procedure document that allows you to manage your asbestos materials in situ on site. So the idea of an asbestos management program generally is that it is a hands-off management tool, in which case you know where your asbestos is, you've identified it, you've conducted your risk assessment, you've completed your labeling. Your policy is we do not touch the asbestos. Anytime we have a project that comes up, we call a consultant to do additional testing. We call this short list of contractors that we've pre-qualified. They're asbestos abatement contractors. They come in, they deal with it. So if you do have a building that has identified asbestos containing material within it, there needs to be some sort of management program in place. And this will have laid out in terms of roles and responsibilities. So ideally you have a program administrator, someone that kind of the gatekeeper that looks after the program, make sure it's up to date, to make sure it's being implemented at the various levels that it needs to be. There's going to be some sort of emergency response procedure, and this may vary depending on your type of facility. If it's a commercial office tower, it may be quite minimal, but if it's a school or an operating hospital where you have significant issues, maybe with old pipes or something like that, and you have water leaks happening regularly, you could have a pretty extensive emergency response procedures. There's going to likely be provisions for regular reassessments. Now, WorkSafe BC doesn't mandate a specific interval for asbestos reassessments. However, they do say your inventory needs to be up to date. So really, that's kind of it can be a personal preference, but generally, you're looking for anywhere from annually to maybe every 5 years to do a reassessment. It's going to talk about worker training and education. So training your staff to know where the asbestos is in the building, what the emergency response procedures are, how to deal with it if there's any kind of issues that come up. You're going to have a qualified contractor or consultant list, maybe people you've worked with in the past or you've pre-qualified. So when work does happen, and maybe the administrator's on vacation, somebody can kind of just go to this list. There's names and phone numbers or email addresses, and they can reach out and contact them. So this asbestos management program actually isn't talked about in the WorkSafe occupational health and safety regulations specifically. They refer to an exposure control plan, but the photo there, the safe work practices for handling asbestos, which is kind of the guidebook of the regulation, does talk about an asbestos management program. So an exposure control plan can also be an asbestos management program, but generally an exposure control plan is for people that are intentionally disturbing or removing asbestos, like a contractor or something like that. But definitely something you want to have if you have a building. So now we have the second poll question. That's over to you, Sam.
That's right. Let me just give me a second to pull this up. And you should see it now.
Yeah, do you have or do you manage buildings with known asbestos materials present? And if so, does the building have an asbestos management program? Don't worry, the answers are anonymous. We won't know who's answered yes or no. Or at least I won't know. Maybe Mark will know. Secretly making notes in the background.
Give it another 15, 20 seconds. Let some stragglers get their response in.
Is there any?
All right, so have it at about 70% yes and about 30% no there, Ryan.
All right. Okay, so, well, if there is a need for an asbestos management program, feel free to reach out to myself or Martin or Sane, and we can definitely answer some more questions and help you out if need be. This slide here is kind of just some general steps in terms of managing asbestos. So the first step, obviously, you need to do an assessment of the building to identify if there is asbestos-containing materials in your building. And at the same time, you're sort of assessing the risk of those materials. So access, condition, friability. Devising and implementing a plan to manage that. So that would be your asbestos management program. And one of the actual things that I forgot to mention was is notification to tenants and or contractors. So that's another key step to managing asbestos, because you can have your management program, train your own staff, project managers, operations facility management people. But when you have third-party contractors coming to your building, you need to make sure that the locations of those asbestos materials are communicated to that contractor and to the tenant. So if you have a tenant that wants to do tenant improvements. They have been told where the asbestos is, and depending on how, how your lease is set up, there may be the tenant becomes responsible for the asbestos, or the owner becomes responsible, removes the asbestos from the space. But making sure that communication is done is a key thing. And whenever a contractor shows up, the first thing they see is, here's our asbestos inventory, and then they acknowledge that they've read and signed off on that, is definitely a key part to the management tool. And then the fourth step there, ensure anyone liable to disturb materials has access to the relevant information. So that's kind of what I was just talking about. But the key to the asbestos management program is communication out to all of your workforce, your tenants, and your contractors that are working for you. And then the last step is making sure you review that program periodically. If there's any regulatory updates, that those are taken into account, but also if your inventory needs to be updated as well. Maybe you've had a large renovation and your inventory was prior to that renovation. You want to make sure that those asbestos materials that were removed are removed from your inventory, so you're not potentially going back into that space 10 years later and seeing, well, I thought we took all the drywall out of the space. Why is it still in the inventory? So make sure you're updating your inventory regularly. I won't spend too much time on this one, but it's essentially a high-level overview of the different sections of the regulation that do pertain to asbestos. So Part 5, 6, and 20. So Part 5 is chemical and biological substances, and it has things like exposure limits, general background levels, exposure control plans, the fact that asbestos is a designated substance, the ALARA principle, all that kind of stuff. Part 6 is really sort of the meat of the regulation as it pertains to asbestos, and everything around inventories, labeling, safe work procedures, management, control of asbestos fibers, contractor procedures and processes, and all of that stuff is encompassed in Part 6. And Part 20 is specific to pre-construction, demolition, or renovation. So one key thing is WorkSafe BC does have this phrase, qualified person. And so what does that actually mean? If you're a CIH, certified industrial hygienist, an ROH, or a CRSP, which is a certified Canadian registered safety professional, or potentially a professional engineer, you can have those designations, but you also need to have the knowledge of management and control of asbestos fibers received through some sort of education and training, experience in the management and control of whether you're creating risk assessments, inventories, work procedures, collecting samples, that kind of thing. And then many of the requirements of the regulation must be administered by a qualified person. And so developing an inventory, doing risk assessments, writing any kind of safe work procedures. So all of that needs to be done by a qualified person. And there is a requirement that any owner or employer that is hiring a consultant, they need to do their own due diligence to ensure that that consultant or contractor is considered a qualified person. So a contractor that is coming to your site to remove asbestos, they need to have an exposure control plan, safe work procedures, risk assessments, all that stuff. You need to make sure that those procedures have been developed by a qualified person. Same with a consultant. If you're hiring a consultant, the owner does have a responsibility to do their own due diligence to verify that. All right, we're going to transition over to reports now. So there's a few different types of reports that we'll talk about here. So one is your baseline inventory, which is we come to your building, we'll collect samples. It's not an intrusive investigation. We're not digging behind walls and sampling the roof and ripping up carpets. Generally, we're sampling surface materials only to develop your inventory. Then there's asbestos reassessments. So this happens on a regular interval, whether it's every year, every 2, 3, 5 years, where you come back to the building with the previous report and you go through and you just verify that the conditions of the material have not deteriorated. If there is damaged material, we make note of that, so that material can be remediated. If there's been some abatements that have happened, then we can kind of update the inventory and remove those materials from the inventory. And other times it could be that if there's regulatory updates and maybe sampling requirements for a particular material have changed, then we can collect additional samples to verify that. Generally, we collect the additional samples and they're still negative, but we've brought the sampling strategy into compliance with the current landscape. And then pre-construction assessments. So anytime you are doing any renovation, it could be a small bathroom floor replacement or demolishing an entire building. The scale of that varies greatly, but anytime you're doing any kind of renovation work that would be beyond general maintenance, you would need to do a pre-construction assessment. So if we go to baseline inventories, so what are they for? What do they tell you? So they're intended to essentially ensure the well-being and health and safety of all the occupants in the building, whether that's workers, general public, any contractors coming into that building. WorkSafe right now only requires that baseline inventories be done for asbestos only. So they're not saying you need to do it for lead or mercury or PCBs or anything like that. But it doesn't cost actually that much more to do a baseline hazardous materials inventory as opposed to a baseline asbestos inventory. So generally that's what we recommend to clients that call us about that. It is not intended for any kind of project specific work, planned renovations or demolitions, simply because the baseline inventory is generally surface materials only. We're trying to do that assessment without causing any sort of significant damage to your building. And it generally only includes interior areas. There are some where we will include the exterior, or we will take samples on the roof, maybe not of the roofing membrane, but we may sample mastics and putties and stuff like that on the roof. So the next one is reassessments. So the first bullet there, they are required by regulation in a sense that it says your inventory must be kept up to date. So again, really this is kind of a risk tolerance thing where we have some clients that they do reassessments every year. Every year we fly to Kitimat to look at the same transite pipe that has not changed condition in the last 15 years. Some other clients, while we reassess their buildings every year, they have such a large portfolio that they amortize that portfolio over 5 years. So we're going into any of their buildings once every 5 years, but it does take us 5 years to get through their entire portfolio. So the reassessment must be done by a qualified person. So again, we're looking at access, condition, friability, collecting any additional samples. Perhaps the first time we were there were some inaccessible areas that we couldn't get into, a server room that was locked, nobody had the key, that kind of thing. So we would kind of fill in that extra information. Inventory is kept current. And then I kind of talked about that last bullet there in terms of how often it happens. But generally, if you have an inventory that's getting beyond 5 years old, and if WorkSafe does happen to pop by your site, they're probably going to be asking you about doing some sort of reassessment or update to that inventory. And then we have pre-construction assessments. So these are going to be generally project specific. So if you have a renovation that's coming up and maybe you're stripping an area right down to base building, or maybe you're just replacing the ceiling tiles and the lighting. Kind of really depends on the scope, but the renovation assessment can be tailored to a specific scope. Like I said, it can be small to maybe just a bathroom, or it can be an entire wing of a hospital. And it's going to include other materials, not just asbestos. So we're going to be obviously looking at asbestos materials, but lead-based paints, PCBs, will include silica, mercury, mold, ozone depleting substances. So we'll, rodent droppings, we'll go through the list that's covered under section 20.112 in the regulation, and that would be in our pre-construction report. But the one good thing is that we can incorporate any previous findings into this pre-construction assessment. So if we have a baseline inventory, or you have a baseline inventory that says we know that all of the drywall joint compound in this building contains asbestos, we don't need to retest it. We can just rely on those previous results and save some money in terms of testing, so we're not doubling up testing. Okay, into project workflow and triggers.
I'll launch the next poll here. And should be active.
Do you currently have an ongoing or upcoming project in the building constructed prior to 2018?
Yeah, we'll stop it there. Got about 75% with a yes and 25% with a no.
All right. So actually, the reason that I chose 2018 is that's actually the year that the federal ban on asbestos in Canada was released. So while we generally don't see asbestos materials sort of that late, we do find asbestos materials kind of well into the 2000s in various types of building materials and products. So, and we're always kind of finding new things. So if you are doing a project, you definitely want to make sure that you have a pre-construction assessment. So this very busy slide is just kind of an example of where Pinchin can assist with any kind of projects that you have coming up. So if you're in the design and planning phase, that's really the ideal time to sort of reach out to us and just kind of discuss the projects with us. How old is the building? What's the scope of the renovation? That kind of thing. Because the sooner you do that, the better it is. Because one, you can, if you do have any hazardous materials, they get identified in the planning stage, and then you can budget and plan for it. Pre-construction. So Pinchin would perform the hazardous building materials assessment. That's what HBMA stands for. And then we could also, based on the findings of that, we could develop a scope of work specifications that you could include in your tender and procurement. We can also assist with that tender and procurement process, writing the specs. We can do any kind of front end stuff. If you have demolition that needs to happen, building demolition, we can provide specifications for that as well. And also really just run the entire project if need be, retain the contractor. We have an in-house construction project management department that can also assist with contracts and all of that sort of stuff. When it comes to actual construction, so Pinchin providing contractor management, any kind of safety oversight, site reviews, air monitoring. There, depending on what you find in the building, there may or may not be a requirement for asbestos air monitoring, air clearances, completion reports. If you are doing any sort of demolition work in the city, in certain cities and municipalities, there's a requirement for permits, salvage and abatement permits and that kind of thing to be filled out by qualified people. So Pinchin can assist with all that, and just making sure you know up front when you do need some of these permits, because we have had phone calls where the building is demolished and gone, and they can't get their demolition permit because they didn't complete their salvage and abatement permit, and they're calling around to try and get a consultant to sort of do that retroactively, and it doesn't work very well. So it can hold up your project. Owner occupancy. So completing any kind of clearance inspections, but beyond that, if there's any sort of LEED, BOMA, or any kind of IEQ sort of testing that needs to be done, we can also assist with that. And then project closeout. So if it's a renovation, updating your inventory, providing completion closeout reports, because that is a requirement for WorkSafe BC. And then closing any kind of permits or anything that you may need to do for your construction project as well. And then just some tips and tricks. So bringing in the consultant at the beginning of the project, or even before the project is in the planning stage, and just getting your pre-construction assessment done. And so you have an understanding of where your hazardous materials are. Because in some cases, depending on the building, you could be weeks, even months, doing hazardous materials abatement even before you can start demolition. So that's obviously a significant schedule impact that needs to be taken into account. Providing accurate scope details to the consultant so they can target their sampling specific to your scope. Conducting your detailed intrusive sampling wherever possible. A lot of times buildings are still occupied when we're doing our assessment. So usually it has to happen in two phases. We do as much as we can at the beginning. Then once the space is vacated, we come back and do some additional testing. Back in the old days when I started, a space would be vacant for weeks and weeks and weeks prior to construction. That's really not a thing that can happen anymore with today's economy. It's always a good idea to include a scope of work or specifications if you are doing a project. It assists in the tender process, and it makes sure that all of your bidders are bidding apples to apples. You're not just tossing a report out there and allowing the bidders to sort of dictate the scope, and you're going to get pricing that can be all over the place. And then always making sure you're including unit costs for hidden or concealed materials, and then we could include that in our specification package. So when you do come across concealed materials, it's a matter of quantity. You already have the unit rate, so you do have some cost certainty. Tendering to qualified contractors is always a good thing. So if you have a pre-qualified list that you use, if you're not sure, feel free to reach out to me. I can kind of give you a list of contractors that we would recommend. And it really depends on the size and scale of the project. You want to have a competent contractor, and once we'll talk about in a few minutes, once the WorkSafe requirements come out for licensing and certification, you will have to hire a contractor. They will need a license or certification to do the work. So hopefully that will weed out some of the not so great contractors. Monitoring the work, having a consultant on site, whether it's doing air monitoring, making sure that the scope of work and regulatory requirements are in compliance. But we would do that by doing site reviews and air monitoring. We could also manage the contractor for you on site. Manage your risk really is kind of a key thing, especially if you're doing an abatement in an occupied building. You want to make sure that that project is managed tightly, that the contractor is somebody is looking at them and watching what they're doing day in and day out. Because if you do have a breach or a leak from that containment, depending on the type of building and the tenants you have, it could be a significant issue and just cause hours and hours and hours of your time to deal with. And the other key thing, the last bullet there, is making sure there's like a good contingency for abatement. And generally, depending on the complexity of the building, we recommend anywhere from about 15 to 30% contingency on the abatement costs. So we can also provide upfront, budget estimates for abatement based on the quantity of materials that are there, but making sure you have enough contingency in your budget to allow for extras, because there will always be materials that are uncovered. It's just the nature of older buildings and renovations and things that are covered up, and we can never find it all. Okay, getting a little tight on time here, so I'm going to jump into asset retirement obligations, and this is a pretty quick summary of it. But this was effective April 1st, 2022. And what is ARO? So ARO stands for Asset Retirement Obligations, and it's actually a legal obligation associated with the retirement of a tangible asset. So a building, infrastructure, something like that. So it does provide guidelines for recognizing, measuring, and disclosing ARO and financial statements. And then this applies to entities that are subject to the requirements of the public sector accounting. And then first AR to include a requirement for asbestos consideration. So essentially you are coming up with a number to provide in your reporting spreadsheets that says we have this building or this facility, and this is what it's going to cost to deal with all the hazardous materials, the subsurface contamination, whatever may be present there. Then who does this apply to? So it can apply to a wide range of buildings and owners that fall under the PSAB. And it can include industrial facilities, commercial properties, infrastructure, extractive industries, oil and gas, utilities, and any kind of specialized facilities. Maybe it's waste control facilities, waste processing facilities, that kind of thing. So what ends up happening is the implications of it. So scope, there's a scope and identification phase, which is extremely important. So one, we kind of need a list of all of your assets, building the right team, whether that's external consultants or you have accountants that are doing it internally and you're getting assistance from external people, but definitely want to build the right team that understands the process. Create an expectation for types of ARO that you may have. So like I said, having your asset list, and it's not going to just be buildings. If you have vacant lands, any kind of infrastructure, you need to consider that. Using consultants or external experts where necessary, and then consulting with your auditor through the process. So once all of this is put together, generally it will go through an audit process before it does get submitted. So we've gone back and forth with various auditors on some of the ARO budgets that we have submitted, and they've kind of wanted to look at how did we come up with these numbers, how did we calculate it, that kind of thing. So where to start? So a fixed asset listing. So if you do have a spreadsheet with all of your assets, it should be incorporated into a capital plan for your business and some sort of strategic plan. But also it could potentially include any leases that you have as well. And depending on the wording in that lease, you may be required to kind of include those as well. If you're some leases that very smart people have written will put the onus of hazardous material abatement on the tenant as opposed to the owner. And I've seen it where the tenant has had to pony up, several $100,000s to remove asbestos when they vacated the space. Oh, there's just a blank slide there. That's interesting. Well, there's supposed to be a flow chart here of a few different things, but I don't know what happened to that. So one thing to note is that right now I'm only talking about the asbestos removal portion of the ARO. There is other requirements in terms of subsurface contamination, underground storage tanks, any kind of like chemical or oil, groundwater contamination, soil contamination that may be there, depending on what you have on the site. That's something that will also have to be taken into consideration. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Gap analysis. Review historical reports, identify gaps that may affect the outcome, and then depending on the gaps, you may need to do some further testing. The assessment portion, so this is where somebody would come to site and kind of go through all of your hazardous materials or the hazards that are present and quantify all of that. And then from that quantification process is where you sort of come up with your estimates, and generally you're plunking things into a spreadsheet with unit rates, and you're kind of using some professional judgment to sort of figure out what the abatement costs or remedial costs are going to be. And then you're going to tabulate all of those costs. You're going to want to include contingencies in those costs, and then usually there's going to be some sort of limitations in there as well, depending on the site, how accessible things were and that kind of thing. Lastly, WorkSafe BC. So there are some new updates coming in that amendment to the Workers' Compensation Act that will require abatement contractors to be licensed and certified by WorkSafe BC. So this is something that other provinces in Canada have been doing for a long time, but BC is finally now sort of getting on that bandwagon. So it aims to improve, obviously, the safety of the workers that are doing the work, reducing potential exposure to asbestos, and it includes mandatory training and a WorkSafe BC administered exam. So the training is generally provided by third-party trainers, WorkSafe isn't providing the training, but they will administer the exam. So I have a couple of links here that will take you to the WorkSafe BC website once the recording's out. But if you go and just kind of Google WorkSafe BC worker training requirements, it will come up. And right now it's still not finalized, so there may be a few things that are that might change, but for the most part, they've kind of laid out what the requirements are, and that's what this slide's going to talk about. So any employer that conducts asbestos abatement work will require a license. So an employer in the business of removing asbestos, you're going to require a license. An employer that in the course of carrying out work in another industry carries out asbestos abatement for someone else. If it's a general contractor doing a renovation and they're coming in and they're demoing out your kitchen or an office space, and in that process they're removing asbestos, they need to be licensed. An employer performing building surveys for the purpose of asbestos abatement, so a consultant like us, we will also require training and being certified. And an employer that transports and disposes of materials that may be asbestos containing, so a hauler that takes asbestos waste to the landfill. So who is not required to be licensed? So an employer that may disturb or handle asbestos materials in carrying out usual maintenance or repair. So plumbers, electricians, HVAC contractors, or an employer whose workers perform asbestos abatement solely for that employer within that employer's buildings. So this is likely applicable to hospital work, maintenance staff, school district maintenance staff, plumbers, carpenters, whatever, that are, cutting out a hole of drywall to access a leaking pipe or something like that. So they'll still require an exposure control plan and training, but they're not going to require licensing and certification. And then the different levels that WorkSafe has laid out for this training is level 1 is for anyone transporting or disposing of asbestos waste. Level 2 is for anyone conducting asbestos abatement work, so an abatement contractor. And then level 3, worksite management. This one is for supervisors and others responsible for the health and safety of asbestos workers. So they're an asbestos abatement contractor. They're the supervisor on site. So there's an additional level that they need to have. And then there's level S, the surveyor, which is the consultant that's conducting asbestos assessments. So this is all planned to sort of be official and rolled out in early 2024. I don't know the exact date, but you can expect some significant changes, next year for consultants, abatement contractors, that kind of thing. 10 on the dot.
Look at that. So I apologize we didn't leave any time for questions. We do have a few, but what we'll do is we'll get back to people individually. Please do, we'll leave it open for a few more minutes. If you do have some questions, please do put it in the questions and answers Q&A so that they do get recorded and we can and get back to everybody.